to ask you how, like, did you get the idea to start this? When did this come about? And like a little bit about your background and like what propelled you in this direction. How did you think of starting something like this?
Okay. So super. So that's like four questions in one. So maybe I'll start with talking about my background first, and then
Yeah.
can talk to you about yeah, why did we sort of decide to start this? But yeah, so I'm Johan. Graduated from Ashoka University in 2018. So about 6 years back. And I did a computer science major, minor in entrepreneurship. But what I was really excited about was going into the social entrepreneurship sector and figuring out different use cases and so on. And so yeah, so first opportunity exactly was in 2018. This was with Professor Mohammed Yunus and his company based out of India. And this was based out of Bombay. And so essentially, what we were doing at Yunus Social Business was, working with tier one corporates in the country, the likes of the Tatas, Mahindras, Birlas, and so on, and essentially creating social businesses for these tier one companies, right? So the thesis that we were sort of trying to validate was that you have your CSR in India, right, which is about 2% of annual profits that companies do. We were trying to understand if companies want to go beyond the 2% mandate and actually try to do much more than that, right? Because the 2% they either give to NGOs and social sector organizations and so on, or their own implementation teams. But we wanted to understand if they wanted to solve environmental and social problems and doing that through business per se, right? So imagine a company where, in their group of companies, they create, one separate company that solves for, social and environmental impact. And that's exactly what social business is. So spent 1 year doing that in Bombay. This was in 2018. Post that, I moved to working in the philanthropy ecosystem because I realized that, when I was advised before that 1 year, realized that it is a bit early in India as a country to sort of wherein the companies will want to solve something like this beyond the mandate, right? So essentially, it will take us about 1 year to even get these clients to sign off on a 6, 7 year long project. Uh, Mainly because the calls for a 7 to 8 year long project are only made at the head, which is the CEO or the CXO level folks, and so therefore business development timelines were sort of quite long to even begin the project, right? So did that for 1 year, moved to working in the philanthropy ecosystem. I was at Dasra again, based in Bombay. A lot of my time and energy was spent in fundraising for the water and sanitation ecosystem in the country. And so, this was a project that was about decentralized treatment of human waste in tier two and tier three cities in the country. And so, along with how Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, both phase one and phase two, was launched by the government to sort of, for open defecation to make, different cities open defecation free and so on. We were going one step beyond that and saying that the toilets that are created and so on, what will happen with the waste that exists in the septic tanks of these toilets? Because the government is focusing on creation of the toilets, but they're not really focusing a lot more on transportation, treatment, and reuse of that waste. That is where we stepped in as an organization, and Gates Foundation, funded us and funded 30 other, NGOs in the space. And I was looking at the fundraising for this project apart from the Gates funding, right? So looking at other investors in India who would want to co-fund this project along with Gates Foundation. So I did that for about 2.5 years. Um, all along, I was based in Bombay and was also sort of involved with a few climate activism kind of not roles per se, but in my free time, I was sort of spending some time on that as well. But in Jan 2022, realized that I sort of wanted to move from the not-for-profit sector to climate technology, climate startup, climate innovation, and climate funding directly per se, because still water and sanitation is more of an adjacency, and so I wanted to work directly in decarbonization. That's when I did a climate fellowship. It's with this organization called Terra.do. And then, yeah, so after my fellowship with Terra.do, I met my co-founders, Ashish and Prajakta. And, when I met both of them, we started by doing a sector landscape study in India to understand what does the climate finance sector in India look like in 2022. The reason we started doing that is because there was a lot of excitement in climate tech uh, by the Indian investors. And again, you will ask me, why was this excitement there? The excitement was there because globally, from the pandemic 2020, 2021 in US and Europe, there was a lot of excitement about climate tech and wanting to invest in sustainable and cleaner solutions. And so that led to a bit of like a trickle down effect, because what happens globally tends to sort of mimic get mimicked in smaller markets, different markets. And so India also as a country sort of tried to mimic that global trend, and so there was a lot of excitement for funding in climate tech. But we wanted to understand, out of all the investors that are actually speaking about climate tech, who is actually making the investments in the space, right? Because one thing is just climate tech investing being a buzzword, but we want to understand, okay, who are actually fulfilling their word and actually sort of investing in climate in India. So that's when we started with the sector landscape study. We learned that there were about 600 investors from India and abroad who are either already supporting the Indian climate entrepreneur currently, or they want to support the Indian climate entrepreneur going forward. Then we said that if we can actually play this role of firstly bringing a lot more capital from foreign markets to the Indian climate startup ecosystem, that can be one use case for us to exist, right? Because most of the capital is sort of concentrated in the global north, and when I say global north, it's USA predominantly, Canada, Europe, and so on. And so first question was, how do we attract a lot more of that capital to come and fund Indian climate startups, right? So that was the first use case. Second use case for us to exist was essentially looking at your Indian funds and this is across venture capital, family office, angel investing, grant funding, debt funding, and so on, and saying that how can we better support the Indian, venture capital ecosystem to really understanding climate tech, number one, being able to underwrite the risk, and being able to sort of fund different climate startups, right? So we found again different use cases there for us to exist. One was essentially, helping these investors with creation of their investment thesis, in terms of what should they fund going forward. That was the first part. Second was more about discovery of climate startups, so helping them in that process. And then if they need support in due diligence of the startup, in getting connected to different market leaders, corporates, and so on, that was also a place where we could support if required as well, right? So that became the second use case. And then the third use case was essentially for us to look at climate startups and saying that what are the problems that a climate startup is facing currently in India? Climate startups face multiple different problems. Problems with respect to business development and the market is one. Problems with respect to lack of regulations is the second. The third is fundraising, right? And so out of these three problems, the first two problems we can't really solve because you need multiple actors to work in coherence to sort of solve that problem, right? And so we said, okay, we can really support them in the fundraising aspect. And so that's the third thing that we looked at, right? So to sort of summarize, three, sort of use cases: global capital to India, Indian capital being better resourced to climate startups, and then supporting climate startups as the third sort of pillar. So these were three problems in terms of three solutions that we started. The first one we started in about Jan 2023 is when we launched that. It's called, it's basically a funder database product, essentially saying that any climate startup in India who wants to raise capital, can they come to the platform, filter on the database, and can they find the investor that is most relevant to them at that point in their fundraising journey, right? So essentially saying that the discovery time that it takes for climate startups, that currently is a very long period of time. It's anywhere between a couple of months to several months, because they have to do this research, devote founders office, interns, founding team, and so on, to really go ahead and figure out who these investors are, do some online research, speak to multiple people, and then find a way to get connected to them. What we are saying is that they can find all of this information in about 10 minutes by using different filters that we've created on the website, right? Which is with respect to thematic, areas of climate tech, because climate tech is very broad, right? There are about 50, 60 different, sub themes easily in climate tech per se. So, filtering by thematic area, by fund size, by investment check size, by kind of capital, so equity or grant or debt. Do they fund hardware, startups versus software startups and so on. So that became really a solution. So that's the database product that we launched in Jan 2023. Um, the second thing that we launched, and this is after a lot of feedback from climate startups, the feedback that they gave us was that, the database is good, but they asked us if we can connect them to different investors and actually act as their fundraising and advisory partner for their fundraising process, right? So we said, okay, very happy to start doing that. And that became the second sort of use case for us for these climate startups, which meant that we operated a lot more like a climate tech investment banking company for the early stage ecosystem. So basically looking at, in terms of investment stages, pre-seed to Series B in terms of sort of stages. And in terms of check sizes, looked at about from $100,000 to about $10 million dollars right now, and supporting them in their fundraising process. But we said that we will only fund these startups who we believe are investment ready, right? And so we have our own, investment readiness sort of, parameters that we look at before we work with the startup. And that has to do with, the milestones that a startup has achieved over the last, few years of them being in operation, to figuring out, who have been their past investors, who are their lead investors, who are they in touch with in conversations right now, and so on. But also sort of helping them figure out, okay, how much capital that they need to raise, how much should they value the organization at, how much should they dilute at that particular funding round, who should they get on the capitalization table, should they be looking at a strategic venture capital organization or a financial VC or an impact VC or a debt provider or a climate VC and so on. Right? So that became the journey in terms of looking at the providing support to the startup essentially. So that's predominantly what we do. We work with a lot of incubators, accelerators, and venture studios in the country because we believe that all of these different organizations, and there are plenty of them, right? I think if you go to the AIM sort of Utter Incubation Innovation Mission sort of website and so on, you'll find easily about 2,000-3,000 incubators, accelerators, and venture studios, and realize that there is no point in creating a separate accelerator or an incubator or a venture studio. Why don't we partner with these folks to increase their probability of success if they launch a climate tech incubation or acceleration or venture studio program? So in that regard, we partner with multiple institutions and so on. We've done some work with with ISB, both the Mohali and the sort of Hyderabad campuses. Done some stuff with NSR Cell, which is IIM Bangalore, trying to do similar stuff with IIT Bombay, IIT Delhi, and multiple other sort of universities. So I'll probably pause here because I've told you I think about my background and what we do at climateXcapital. But yeah, happy to jump into multiple questions. We also do some work in Goa. We also try to do some work in the Andamans. My third co-founder is based out of the Andamans. Uh, and yeah, we do a bunch of stuff. We also operate a climate tech WhatsApp group. It's called Climate Tech for India. It has about 600 people, 700 people on it currently. Only investors and only climate startups who are a part of that group. Essentially saying that can we have this community together, create a safe space for them to ask difficult questions? Because obviously, climate tech as a space is a combination of so many different subsectors and sub themes, right? It has a lot of science, it has a lot of physics, it can have a lot of biotechnology if it's that, it can have a lot of chemistry involved if it is a chemical, decarbonization kind of a, project and so on. And so creating a safe space for these investors to ask hard questions and to learn from these startups, but also figure out, okay, how should investors invest better going forward? So we operate that, want to create an industry body kind of a structure that can advocate for the government for a climate policy, because the climate policy is very important to increase the momentum in the climate tech space, because different actors can take different times, can take different periods of time to really respond to a climate solution. So unless there is an incentive by the government or tax by the government and so on, these big corporates will not move towards cleaner solutions, right? So We operate that group there, and in Andamans, we are doing some work on decarbonization of the Andamans. And that is something that my second co-founder, Prajakta, leads in the Andamans right now. So I'll probably pause here and then happy to answer and go into other aspects.
I mean, that's quite an inspiring journey, to say the least. Um, I was going to ask you, like, what made you choose the global south per se for this startup? Like, obviously, you are from here, and like the roots are here, and that could have been one of the reasons. But other than that, like, what made you choose the global south as your, I mean, focus area? And also, what were some of the challenges that you faced while, starting with this? And are there any challenges that still linger on, which, I mean, were there in the beginning, or have you been able to solve some of them?
Mhm. Understood. So I'll answer the first question first. So why did we choose the global south? I think firstly because, as you mentioned, I'm based here, and so therefore we understand this geography a lot better in terms of having access to the right network, understanding different climate solutions in India's context. We also don't understand different contexts. I mean, I've never lived in Europe, so I will not understand Europe in terms of culture, in terms of policies, in terms of climate solutions that will work there and so on. So that's another reason. But I think the most important reason is that the global south, uh, you know, is at risk of facing the most amount of challenges with respect to climate impacts, right? Because of rising temperature, in terms of on land, so leading to, let's say, uh, extra deaths because of, let's say, heat waves and so on, to rising flood levels, sea levels and so on, which leads to flooding and so on. And so the impact of climate is basically, you can see it a lot more in the global south, which is why I wanted to work here. And the gap in finance is the most here, right? Because your wealthier nations have a lot of capital, and they don't tend to face a lot of issues with respect to global warming and climate change just yet. But that is changing in different geographies. So that's why I decided that the biggest gap is here, the biggest impact is here. So the biggest return of investment and capital will also be here if the capital is deployed in the right manner, essentially. So that's the reason in terms of why we chose the global south. Now, in terms of challenges that we face, so um, yeah, so I think multiple challenges that we've sort of faced over the last couple of years. First is essentially on building trust, right? And I think that's an important part, because you need to build trust with both stakeholders, which is investor community and the startup community, right? And you need to build trust because you want to show the investors that you can deliver quality startups to them, that at least where the basic hygiene check and a first level of due diligence has been done, right? So founder due diligence has been done, some technology due diligence has been done. The storyline, makes sense. There is some kind of revenue or forecast or projection to sort of revenue and so on. So first is trust, essentially, with the investors and the startups, because even with the startups, you have to be able to, I think, just deliver that, show that you can support them in their fundraising process, right? That you have the right network, you have the right expertise, and so on. So I think that's one. I think the second is that um, there are challenges with respect to kinds of capital that is available in India as a country. And when I say kind of capital, I'm basically talking about, let's say, if it is grant capital, how do we tap into these pockets of grant capital, and how do we increase these pockets of grant capital? And the reason is that, and that again, it follows through from how the government essentially demarcates capital in their budgets for innovation and so on. And so in the US, for example, you have your Department of Energy and so on, and that have a lot of capital where they demarcate for innovations, for research, for universities, and so on. And so that ecosystem is very healthy. And that engine has been running for the last 100 years, right? Essentially since World War One, World War Two, right? So that engine is sort of very well oiled to be able to churn out very good research, and that research then gets commercialized eventually in the form of a climate solution. That is a problem in India, wherein we don't have the right, we don't, we've not had the amount of capital, number one, that the government allocates. And it's not really been, really a topic that the government has want to push over a period of time, which is why we face a challenge with respect to not enough capital going to innovation, and not enough capital being made available for climate solutions from a technical lens, essentially. So that is a challenge for us and a lot of our startups who need grants and who need subsidies in the short term to be able to solve for the technology and to be able to de-risk the technology. And so that again is being made available by foreign players, and some by Startup India seed fund scheme, some by Nidhi Prayas, but those grant amounts tend to be very small in terms of like 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs, and so on. So that is also another challenge that we face to in terms of unlocking. The third challenge that we face is, I think, being able to understand the need of the sector and then move accordingly. Because, you know, something that was a problem 2 years back will not be a problem 2 years later. So, for example, something that, discovery of investors was a problem 2 years back, especially from a venture capital perspective. That has, in some way or shape or form, been solved for, but obviously there is so much more scope to solve for it. But what I'm trying to say is that now, for example, because the ecosystem matures and becomes much bigger and so on, there is a bigger need to find corporate venture capital folks in the country. So essentially, how you have your corporate CSRs, where big corporates like your Adani and your Reliance and so on and so forth, they need to have corporate venture capital arms that can invest in startups, that can acquire startups, and so on. And so that ecosystem also is not very mature in India as a country just yet. It's much more mature in US, Europe, and so on. But that is also something that needs to develop, because if it doesn't develop, then the question remains of how will these startups exit, their funding round at some point of time, right? Because somebody will have to either buy them out in one form of an exit, or they will have to IPO, right? There are very few exits at this point in time, and so on. So that tends to remain another problem. And so our focus now has changed into looking at CVCs as a funding group, or funding pocket to unlock for climate startups in India. That's another focus. The last area maybe I would focus again on is just giving you another example and saying that a lot of climate solutions right now are basically execution games and are infrastructure heavy games. For example, if you want to change energy systems, you have to go to, change from fossil fuel to renewable energy. Renewable energy is not just software, right? You can't just create an app and say that, okay, I will, solve for solar energy. You have to have solar panels. Those solar panels have to be a part of a solar plant. There has to be grid infrastructure and so on that has to, support that. There needs to be storage infrastructure to store that energy. And that requires a different kind of capital pools that are not really available in India yet at scale. Right. So essentially, capital that can fund infrastructure heavy projects in the country. So energy was one, as I mentioned. There is also your mobility, clean mobility. So charging infrastructure and setting those kinds of systems up. Um, yeah. Yeah. So I think that's essentially, I think I would say maybe is my response to your second question, which is about challenges that we face right now.
Okay, sir. So I would like to follow up on like you mentioned you have worked with other climate entrepreneurs and everything. So how do you ensure that the climate entrepreneurs you work with have the access to the right opportunities and networks to amplify their impact?
Mm. Interesting question. So the question is, how do we ensure that they have the right opportunities, right? So I think
Yeah.
access to the right opportunities tends to be lesser of a problem, because that can be made available by way of, let's say, connecting them to different people, right? So that's, I think, easier to solve for. I think what's not easier to solve for is essentially the quality of the entrepreneur and the quality of the thinking that ensures that they are building a good business that scales to a venture investable or a venture returnable opportunity. So that's essentially the problems that we have to try and fix as an ecosystem. And that's essentially, some amount of capacity building, some amount of, strategy thinking with them, pushing them and asking them hard questions about unit economics, questions about, improving their profit margins, decreasing their costs, and so on. So that's essentially the question. But in terms of opportunities, I think opportunities tend to exist, but we're trying to, solve for it in different shapes and forms. Like, for example, in the Andamans, we want to run a challenge, essentially that, wherein we are bringing the community and the government together, and we're inviting startups from the mainland in energy, in mobility, in agri-tech to come and apply their solutions, then deploy the solutions in Andamans, essentially. We want to do that, similar thing in Goa as well, because in Goa, for example, you have your biggest drivers of emissions is energy, transportation, tourism, and agriculture. These are the four biggest sectors in Goa. And then obviously you have pharmaceutical, and then you have, mining, but I'm going to leave mining and pharmaceutical right now. So even in India, in Goa's context, is to figure out, okay, how can the startups on our platform and on our communities come in and actually do these pilots in Goa. So, trying to work with the government, trying to, build, different collaboratives here and platforms here in Goa as well, uh, and so on. And so we will also run something in Bombay with, WRI maybe over a period of time, because they were influential in the creation of the Mumbai Climate Action Plan. Yeah, so I think that's a response, maybe, to your question. I don't know if it helps answer.
It did help.
Yeah, so your advisory team boasts of two very great gentlemen, one of which is Ashish Goel, who has been a founder at Urban Ladder as well. So how
Yeah.
have these people helped you in reaching your vision and your dream that you have to achieve in the coming years?
Yeah. I think couple of things, right? So firstly, Ashish is very interesting because he was writing a clean energy blog in India from 2008 to 2011. And yeah, there is no, he unfortunately lost all those blogs, and there is no source for either me to read them or anybody to read them, but he used to write that back then. And he would have started a clean energy startup if he did not go ahead with the Urban Ladder, essentially back in 2011. So that was, I think, his conviction back then. But there were problems with respect to, the US clean energy ecosystem, because that became big, and then there was a bust in the clean energy space in the US. And so that had trickle down effects all over the world, right? Which basically meant that for the next 10 years almost, there was no or very little trust in climate tech and investing in climate tech because of that. So he did not start a climate startup back then in 2011. But essentially, he has been a climate tech angel investor over the last 3 years, in 3, 4 years in India, and he's funded about 32 climate tech startups. So he understands the climate tech ecosystem, quite a lot. I think he is India's most sought after climate tech angel investor at this point in time, and he usually invests first check in any company that he sort of comes into. So I think his involvement in this project has brought in a lot of expertise in this space, because obviously he has spoken to, if he's invested in 32, he's probably spoken to about 300, 400 entrepreneurs easily, if not more, right? So he's able to bring that expertise. He's also able to bring some amount of network of from the venture capital ecosystem, because during his journey at Urban Ladder, he had to raise a lot of capital, right, in terms of grants or equity or debt. So that's also something else that he's been able to bring to us at climateXcapital in terms of funder network. The last thing I would say is that he was also a part of these two very important institutions in India, um, and one is IIT Bombay. So he was a part of IIT Bombay, studied there in I think between 1997 to 2001, and he was also a part of IIM Bangalore. So he's also trying to galvanize those two ecosystems to be a lot, further ahead from a climate tech thinking, and also to be able to develop and generate climate tech entrepreneurs. So I think these are maybe his contributions to the organization, and this support therefore helps us in quite a lot in speaking to different entrepreneurs and giving them the right advice, in poking and asking the right questions, because most often investors don't tend to give very good feedback, because if you're an investor, you're speaking to 200 startups a month or more, right? So you have very little time, very little bandwidth. You will not be able to respond to everybody, so they don't go ahead and give very good feedback. So that's where we come in as well, and Ashish is able to bring in a lot of good feedback to a lot of startups as well. So I think that maybe that's my response, I think, to your question. Yeah.
Yeah, so to adding to that, Anshuman is also a part of Terra.do, where you were doing
Yeah.
your fellowship. So how has his involvement helped you, or how did that relationship grow into an advisory for him? So how would you like to answer that?
Yeah. I think very good question. So essentially the project, so the company was started because I did a project with Terra back in April 2022 to about September 2022. So the idea came from Anshuman, essentially, and it was less of an idea and more of a project that he wanted to run. He wanted to understand more about what is the non-dilutive capital landscape looking like in India, essentially. So grants and debt, essentially, is what he wanted to look at. And that's when I got involved, and I led the project, and came up with the entire and delivered on the work and so on. And so Anshuman was very instrumental in really spearheading the project and funding the project back then in 2022 April, right? So for the first 6 months, Anshuman funded the project, seeded the project, and so on, and was instrumental, therefore, in a very big way. Because if he had not done it, then climateX Capital possibly would not have been born at that point in time, essentially. Uh, and come to now, I think from an advisory perspective, we seek advice not very often, maybe once every 6 months, once every year times, because Anshuman is also based in Stanford in the US and comes down to India very rarely. I think a lot of his focus now is on ensuring that as an organization, we become a lot more financially sustainable. And so he sort of tries to push us in that direction, that tries to really, figure out different pockets where we can generate revenue from. Currently, it's the startups, but let's say it could be the investors also over a period of time, right? It could be the corporates also over a period of time. So I think that's his role essentially in trying to push us to, getting to the right, financial security for the organization.
Uh, Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, Yush.
Okay, great. So it's quite a great and innovative work that Climate Capital is doing. I just had a question around like how does Climate Capital is advancing their role in the SDG 13 and what strategies or projects they are involved in that could help contribute to the impact of climate change.
And
Got
just
it.
to add to that, SDG 13, I'm pretty sure you know, is about climate change. I mean, like your entire startup revolves around that. So we'd like to know more about that.
Yeah. I think when you really operate in the field, you are not really asking questions about SDGs as much, essentially because, yeah, I think most folks outside the sector tend to look at it as SDG 1 to, 17 and so on. But I think we're trying to do it in terms of multiple different aspects, and me a lot more so individually as well, right? So um, started doing it in terms of, so you can do multiple things at the personal level. You can do things at the social level, and then you can do things at the family level, and you can do things at, let's say, the organizational level, right? So maybe start from the personal level. So essentially, rather maybe start from, yeah. So a lot of my career has revolved around climate and social development and impact. So that sort of ticks the box. I do a bunch of workshops also as a part of climate education for different stakeholders, and now it's being housed under climateXcapital as well. And so essentially, working with a lot of NGOs, working with corporates, working with students, working with universities to talk about what is really, what are the range of solutions needed to solve for climate change. Because the problem currently is that we sometimes don't understand what are how many solutions do we need and how much do we need each in its own regard, right? Because you have obviously recycling as one very easy thing, or one very visible thing, right? Which is plastic recycling and so on. Then you have afforestation, which is growing trees and so on. But these are only two solutions in the whole arsenal of solutions. So essentially, I do these workshops, and so that sort of helps. So in different shapes and forms, working with institutions also to do this, so that there are a lot more climate entrepreneurs that come up in this space. Doing this with organizations wherein their cohort is not working on climate already, but through the program they want to work on climate change and find climate jobs. Right. So these workshops therefore also then help a lot more people find climate jobs in this space. So this work essentially on climate education therefore drives a lot of attention, people to working and finding climate jobs and so on, right? So that's, I think, one lever in terms of how we advance SDGs 13 at this point in time. The second lever is on capital. Essentially, and a lot of the work that I mentioned on, that climateXcapital is doing is meant to ensure that we have the right amount of capital and quality of capital to be able to ensure that we're doing this work as well. Right. And yeah, I think those are two main things. I used to do a lot of climate activism before, which also has its unique role in the space as well. Because if you don't have climate activism, then a lot of the projects that you don't want, and these, it's called whatever development projects, they tend to sort of come up, right? And it's happened in Goa as well. I don't know if you guys have heard and seen the Goa story, but your three infrastructure projects that were going to come up in which is your double tracking of the railways, widening of the highways, and your Tamnar project, they were all put on pause and maybe abolished. I don't know where they are right now because of climate activism in the pandemic, essentially. So used to do a bunch of that, but that has become a lot lesser now. So I think through climate education and climate finance, directly sort of trying to move the needle on SDG 13, especially right now. I don't know if that helps, Ayush.
Yeah. Just one little follow-up question. Looking back at your journey in the climate space, could you share a few stories on any of the startups that you have worked with and what impact they had in the world?
Got it. Uh, Very interesting question. And so I think I can talk about one startup that we were working with. It's called Carbon Strong, and Carbon Strong essentially is working to create low carbon concrete in India. Right, and as if you do a quick Google search, you will see that concrete and buildings essentially are a very big contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's about between 10 to 15% or 20%, some number there. And the creation of cement, essentially, is again is a very very big industry for carbon emissions at this point in time. So what Carbon Strong does at this point in time, they are creating low carbon concrete by infusing carbon dioxide in the concrete making process. Essentially, what that does is that it makes the concrete blocks a lot more stronger than your conventional blocks. So that's one thing. Uh, because it makes it stronger and because of the chemistry that sort of goes on, and happy to talk about that, they require less unit volume of cement in the same quality of the brick, essentially, that they're making. So by, let's say, by using about 10-20% less, cement, again, there is a CO2 sort of, emission saving potential at that point in time. The third area that they're working on is on curing of the concrete blocks. So essentially, when people build a building, you will see that they put water over the building for a period of 15-20 days, right? And that's essentially called is curing, wherein you're trying to make the cement hard over a period of time, right? And so they are doing a carbon dioxide based curing, which therefore ensures that in all the three solutions that they have, or other in making the brick, they are using carbon dioxide or saving carbon dioxide. So it's essentially a carbon negative brick. So we were working with them on their fundraise about last year, and I believe that was sometime June or July, I believe. And so they got funding. They created their first plant based out of Bangalore. Then this was a pilot plant. It's a smallish plant, and now they're sort of deploying their first commercial facility with one builder in Hyderabad, essentially. And so if this works, it can essentially try to decarbonize a lot of the buildings in India. And again, that's obviously a very, very big dent, because not a lot of startups are working in this space in this regard at this point in time. So I think maybe Carbon Strong's journey is, I think, a very interesting journey. Happy to maybe share, I think, more in terms of other startups that they are doing in this space. But maybe I'll pause here and maybe check in if you have any questions. Yeah.
Uh, Thanks for sharing that, Johan. I would like to ask a follow-up on that because the story that we are aiming to build for the Aim to Flourish, project is regarding the real-world impact of like what the company that we choose is doing. So we'd like to hear a couple of more examples of the startups that you've worked with and like the real-world impact that they are creating, because that would
Mhm.
help us create a more compelling story.
Got it. Got it. Maybe I can share another example, and this is of Farm Theory. That's another startup, and we're currently actually working with them, right? So it's been about maybe 2 months since we've been working with them, and it's a very interesting story. So they are working on ugly produce in the fruits and vegetables space, uh, right? And you can also call it free form produce. Essentially, it's your bananas, chickus, papayas, essentially, that are misshaped. They look like a different color, and essentially, what tends to happen is that about 40% of smallholder farmers, the produce of smallholder farmers in the country, essentially is not bought and ends up going to waste because of essentially people not buying that, right, at the mandi and so on. Because most people, and even when you go to the market and you buy vegetables and fruits, you will look at the most beautiful looking produce, and you will pick the best shaped ones, and the other ones essentially nobody's picking, right? Because that's essentially how we pick fruits and vegetables. So what they are doing, and their solution is essentially a B2B solution where they only work with ugly produce at this point in time, and they are finding markets and linking it to, let's say, different kitchens, trying to work with your, Zomato Hyperpure and so on, and finding use case and value for that. And so the impact is multifold. One is that from a wastage perspective, a lot less wastage at the farm level, right, which was about 30 to 40%, and that could have been realized in terms of revenue, right? So there's a revenue angle one for the farmer, because they would essentially not get any revenue for the 40% of their produce. Now they're finding a lot more revenue for that. That's the first thing in terms of impact. The second impact I would say is a lot more about emissions, because when these fruits and vegetables sort of perish and are decomposing, they are again releasing carbon dioxide and methane, which is again greenhouse gases. Right, so there is a direct impact again on emissions at this point in time, which they're again solving for in this case as well. And then again, from a business perspective, for a lot of the businesses that are buying from them, there is again about a 15 to 20% discount for them than the conventional mandi rates or market rates, because they're getting this produce and sourcing it at a cheaper rate. So I think these would be maybe some, I think, good examples. But I don't know, again, if this helps in for the example in terms of real world impact, because again, there is a finance impact, there is working with marginal farmers. There's also less wastage and more more productivity at the farm level.
Definitely, that helps. Like majorly, we are looking for impact in the environmental sector, like environment, climate change, basically how you are mitigating the impact of factors that are exacerbating climate change right now. So, I mean, if you could also share some examples later on over chat, like someplace else, that completely works. I think Anushka has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi. Sorry, I had internet issues, so I kept logging in, logging off out of the meeting. But to
No
understand
worries.
more this better, probably if you could help us understand what kind of funding or resources ClimateX provide to such startups and entrepreneurs, and how in turn it helps in coming up with scalable solutions for the climate issues that we have at hand.
Yeah. I think good question. So I think from a funding perspective, so we don't have our own capital right now. So we're not a fund per se. We're more of like a facilitator of funds. That's one part. Second part is that my co-founder Ashish, as I mentioned, he is an angel investor. He's funded about 32 climate startups till date. So that he also sort of runs under ClimateX Capital right now. Usually first check in any company and so on that he sort of invests in. So from a finance perspective, we bring, the whole the finance product, which is essentially our funding database, essentially that we have. And then we sort of, bring this angel investing sort of platform as well for the climate startups. So I think that's one sort of big resource. I think the second big resource is essentially being able to provide assets to different incubators and accelerator programs and so on to help their startups in their sort of fundraising journey. For example, we did something with ISB recently on their EV accelerator program. So we were able to really sort of, tell them, what are the pockets of capital that sort of exists, from a grant equity debt perspective, from a stage perspective, right? From a pre-seed to series ABC, who are these capital providers, that are there. Also sort of helping them answer and address a lot of these critical questions with respect to really, you know, how do exits happen in this sector at this point in time, right? How do you really value your organization and your startup? So how do you really, figure out dilution and so on? And these are all really softer elements of helping an entrepreneur because these are all first-time entrepreneurs. And so really helping them find clarity in their thought process from a fundraising lens and a capital raising lens also tends to be a big sort of a lever in helping them reach scale because if you really see the space right now, most startups right now are aggregated at the early stages, right? So it's pre-seed, seed, pre-series A, series A at max. There are very few at the series B, C, D levels, essentially. And the goal of our organization and a lot of the other organizations is to ensure that we move them from early stage to early growth to PE to IPO and so on as quickly as possible, essentially. So what we want to do going forward, as I mentioned, is we want to, target CVC pools, so corporate venture capital pools. And along with that, we also want to sort of target, corporates who can possibly be buyers of such solutions, essentially. Because if you look at it in terms of who is buying climate solutions right now, it is still your 2000 top corporates in India, for example. And they're buying different kinds of solutions, right? They're buying energy solutions, they're buying water-based solutions, they're buying, different assets, on the ground. They're buying, ESG solutions in terms of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, again, the question, yeah, I think a couple of assets. One is, fundraising as an aspect, and the second is the advice that we provide to different incubators, accelerators on sector-wise specific information on, yeah, uh, from a fundraising lens. Yeah.
Okay, so
I,
I
I don't know
have
again if that
just
helps
one.
answer your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, that was helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have one more question. How does Climate as Capital ensure that funders and investors see a balance between profitability and climate impact?
That's a very good question. And I think to answer this question, one needs to understand how do these funds how are they set up in the first place, right? And therefore, who holds power at what points in the journey of the fund? A fund, basically, you want to go, Prakhar?
I just wanted to, like, sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted you to explain the flow of work that happens and then answer this question so that we have a better understanding of how exactly climateX Capital operates. And then you can like go ahead and answer that question. Sorry to interrupt.
Got it. So, what is our process essentially that we follow?
Yeah,
Got it.
exactly.
Got it. So in terms of a process, I mean, a lot of our, um, so I lead the startups and investor onboarding and, the entire operations and journey at climateX Capital. I have a few people who sort of work with me. Um, Most startups will hear about us through investors, through other ecosystem enablers, through LinkedIn, very good channel, and so on. And so people essentially come to our LinkedIn, they come to our website. We have, a funder database button, and on our website where they, if they let's say they click on that, they get access to the funder database for free. So it's like a freemium model wherein one part is free, the second part is paid. So on the free part, they can go through the entire database, and if they need support, they click on a form and they send us their investor deck or investment deck. Once they send us that investment deck, it's basically a request to us to support them in their fundraising process. So on a weekly basis, we evaluate these decks. We go, we check out them in our internal calls, and then we figure out who is it that we want to really take on as a client or not, and then we schedule calls and so on. Uh, in those calls, we do a couple of, we do about 2 interactions at max, and essentially try to understand if the startup is investment ready, which is understanding what are the milestones that they have achieved till date, how much capital has gone to the organization till date, how much dilution has gone, been there so far. Have they done any pilots? Is there any pre-revenue? Do they have any intellectual property? Do they have defensibility in the market? What is the quality of the team? And so on. So once we have answers to these questions and the answers are all green and not red, essentially we will share with them our commercials. If they are okay with our commercials, then we onboard them as a client. So this is all the work that happens in pre-onboarding of a client. During the onboarding phase, essentially, we understand their fundraising process, who all have they reached out to. So they send us, all of that information. They share information about their data room. A data room is essentially all the, the information that, that they will share with investors eventually. So that includes your, financial data from the past several years, your MIS, your company related information, if you have any contracts, if you have any IPs, the licenses for those, and so on. And so we evaluate the financial, investor list, the data room, and then we start our own sort of outreach process. Then that can take, a couple of weeks to about a month or so. If there is interest, then we sort of make the introduction between the investor and the startup, and then sort of discussions on go on, and then we advise the startup till the closing, which is how much to dilute, how much to value yourself, and so on and so forth. So that's essentially on the process, essentially, Prakhar, and happy to again, go into a bit more depth. Uh, Now, to answer your question, Yashika, uh, as I was mentioning, it's important to understand how do they raise funds before, and then figure out, okay, how do they deploy these funds, and how much influence can somebody like us or anybody else have on the space. So most funds are, it's, they create their investment thesis essentially on a space, and it could be the artificial intelligence, edtech, climate tech, health tech, and so on. If it's climate focused, then it's only climate focused, and so on. But the thing is that there's a GP and there's an LP. A GP is basically, it's called general partner. They basically, are in charge to run the fund and are basically accountable to their LPs, right? Which is your limited partners. Your limited partners are basically people who, as institutions, fund, right? So they could be multilateral organizations, they could be family offices, right? They could be corporations in different spaces and so on. And so they are your LPs. And between a GP and an LP, you have a year essentially that you say that you will return the capital by. That's either 8 years or 10 years or 12 years essentially, right? And there's also a flavor about how much capital you will return, essentially, so that some number is, basically discussed between your LP and your GP, uh, and uh, and so on. So that's about that. Now, it's important to understand who all can we influence in what manner, because you have different kinds of investors as well, right? You have your typical financial VC, you have your impact VC, you have your climate VC, you have your generalist VC, right? Your climate and your impact VC, more often than not, are looking at climate impact and are looking at social impact while they are funding, essentially. And so sometimes they are okay with lesser returns, right? And then you have your financial VC and your generalist VC, and more or less they're usually the same because they are usually generalist in nature. Um, they don't tend to look at impact from a impact or a climate lens. They tend to look at financial returns as much as possible, because for them, again, it's bottom line, right? Like they only care about how much money can they return to their LPs, because if they don't return enough money to their LPs in that particular fund, they will not be able to raise another fund in their next round and cycle. So what I'm trying to say is that there is therefore limited influence that one can have as an external stakeholder on these investors, because I cannot go and tell somebody to balance their financial return for more climate impact at this point in time, because why will they listen to me? Right? They are obligated to their shareholders, who at that point are their LPs, essentially. So what we can do instead is, instead of influencing them or trying to sort of trying to help them balance impact versus uh, uh, financial return versus impact, what we can help is increase the standard of these entrepreneurs who are pitching to them, by telling them that they need to look at their financial model and their unit economics and their business case as much as their climate case, essentially. And that's what the ecosystem is moving towards, which is that people don't care about climate tech or climate solutions or climate impact, even investors. They should, and they claim that they do, but they don't, right? And so at the end of the day, even a climate business has to be profitable and has to have a good amount of profit, so that, for a generalist investor, they fund a climate tech company rather than an artificial intelligence company, per se. So it's not as easy as it may probably seem for us to tell an investor to balance impact versus financial returns. I don't know if that helps answer. Okay.
Um, I think that more than answers the question. We'd like to thank you so much for taking your time out from your busy schedule and like giving your 1 hour to us. We aim to create a compelling story so that we can win at the Aim to Flourish Awards, and also like help you gain some more, visibility or something like that in the educational circles at least. I'm pretty sure that you guys
Yeah.
are doing great, and we definitely come back to you in terms of getting some more examples of the startups that you've been working for. I think
Yeah.
that we can do even without a call. So like if you are willing to share some more stories with us, like in the course of the next few days, will be great for us. And yeah, thank
Done.
you so much, Johan, for like giving us time and for such insightful answers. Like we really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks to you guys for, I think, finding interest in the work that we do, and yeah, I mean, hope this inspires, I think, a lot more people to work in the climate space, including, I think, the five of you. I think that'll be quite cool that you guys end up working in the space, and yeah, I mean, at some point, hoping that maybe I can come back to campus to probably do one of the workshops that I was talking about. But I think, yeah, probably that's a separate conversation that maybe Prakhar, you can have with Professor Divya, and we can try and schedule something for sometime in the coming year. So
And
yeah,
I'm definitely
excited to
going
do
to.
stuff.
Yeah, we are excited to have you back on campus. Like we'd like to interact with you in person.
Done, done. So super. Have a wonderful day, folks. And yeah, speak soon.
Yeah, speak soon. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, sir.
Bye bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Good day.